Hello and welcome to our next lesson in this topic looking at evolution and inheritance. In last lesson we looked at what evolution meant, what the terms natural selection meant, and we also looked at the theories of Darwin and Lamarck. Today we're going to be looking at the evidence for evolution. By the end of this lesson you should be able to describe why Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection were not initially accepted. You should be able to explain the evidence that led Darwin to propose the theory of evolution by natural selection, and you should be able to evaluate Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection against the common beliefs at the time. So, Charles Darwin, as we said in the previous lesson, was the scientist who came up with this theory of evolution by natural selection. Okay? So, we can say that Charles Darwin help if I could spell Charles Darwin came up with the theory of evolution by natural selection. With the theory of evolution by natural selection. Now, something that we didn't mention last lesson is that Charles Darwin didn't come up with this theory independently. He didn't come up with this by himself. Okay? Another scientist from Scotland by the name of Alfred Russel Wallace also came up with the same theory, and Alfred Russel Wallace wanted to publish his data. So he wrote to Darwin saying, Darwin, I've come up with this theory by which organisms change over time due to them becoming more or less adapted to their environment by natural selection. And Darwin started to panic. Darwin felt that if he didn't publish his data, Alfred Russel Wallace would have gotten all the credit for it. Now, Darwin was worried about this because he'd spent such a long time sitting on the data. What you have to understand is that Charles Darwin was apprehensive to release his evidence. He was apprehensive to release his theory to the world because he knew that he would face lots of ridicule, which we'll talk about in a moment. So we can add underneath here that Darwin came up with this theory along with another scientist named Alfred Russel Wallace. Alfred Russel Wallace. Now, Darwin came up with his theory over 20, 30 years. He collected data for his theory for many, many years. And he was just scared to release it as he knew that people would reject his ideas. Okay? So we can say that Darwin collected evidence for his theory over many decades. But didn't release the theory but didn't release the theory out of fear of backlash. Out of fear of backlash. Now, lots of people, this is a common misconception, and this is why I've put it in red. Lots of people feel or think that Darwin just came up with this theory and he thought, actually, organisms evolved from a common ancestor over time. I'm just going to put it out there. Darwin knew that this idea was going to be massively disruptive to the dogma at the time, to the way people viewed the world, and he was really apprehensive to release it. He knew that when he released this theory, people would discredit him as a scientist, and people would sort of question who he is as a person. It wasn't until Alfred Russel Wallace came up with exactly the same theory and was saying that he was going to publish it, that Darwin was forced to publish his theory. Now, ultimately, people did object to Darwin's theory. Okay, oh, no, we don't want to do that. We want a copy from the PowerPoint. People did object to Darwin's theory. Okay, and we can put the subheading, why did people object to Darwin's theory? Why did people object to Darwin's theory? Now, Darwin released his book on the origin of species in 1859, okay? This caused a lot of sensation, and lots of people were excited by the ideas that Darwin came up with. So we can say that Darwin released his theory in the book on the origin of species, in 1859. Okay? Now, lots of people were excited by this. Lots of people saw the sort of potential in the theory. But there were lots of reasons why scientists took some time to accept it. Okay? Now, one of them was that the theory of evolution by natural selection challenged God, and that the fact that people felt that God had created all the animals and plants on Earth. Okay? So this theory went against the idea that God had created all life on Earth. So people felt that God had created all of the organisms that we see around us today. Okay? Lots of scientists felt there wasn't enough evidence. So even the people who could ignore the religious side felt that there wasn't enough evidence. So scientists felt there was not enough evidence. to support the theory. Okay. And finally, there was no mechanism to explain how characteristics were passed from parents to offspring. You have to remember that this was 50 years before anybody had any ideas about genetics. This was 50 years before the ideas of Mendel were accepted. So we can say finally that scientists did not understand the process of genetics or inheritance. So scientists didn't understand that characteristics were passed from parents to offspring. So Charles Darwin came up with a theory of evolution by natural selection. Darwin came up with this theory along with another scientist named Alfred Russel Wallace. Darwin collected evidence for his theory over many decades, but didn't release the theory out of fear of backlash. It wasn't until Alfred Russel Wallace threatened to release his own data that Darwin was forced to release his in 1859 in a book called On the Origin of Species. This went against the idea that God created all life on Earth, so it was very controversial. Scientists felt that there wasn't enough evidence to support the theory at the time, and scientists didn't understand that organisms inherited genes from their parents to create their own genes and their own phenotypes. Okay, so what I want to focus on is this one here. Scientists felt there was not enough evidence to support the theory, but remember, Darwin had collected evidence for many decades for his theory. So what evidence did Darwin collect that made him believe that this was the correct theory? So we can put, first of all, Darwin's observations on the HMS Beagle. We can underline that, okay? Now, Darwin was born to a very affluent family, okay? And as a result, he got the opportunity to sail around the world, surveying the lands and checking that maps were correct on something known as the HMS Beagle. Now, Darwin was employed to keep the captain of the ship sort of occupied. He was employed to talk to him and be his friend, because the captain of the ship wouldn't talk to the other crewmates. The captain of the ship was obviously nobility, and Darwin was employed as someone who was seen of the same social stature to sit and talk to him while on the Beagle. Now, Darwin travelled around the world on the Beagle between the years of 1831 and 1836. So, Darwin travelled around the world on the HMS Beagle between 1831 and 1836. So he was on the HMS Beagle for 5 years. Now, whilst he was on the HMS Beagle, Darwin started making notes about all the different wildlife he saw because he was a keen biologist. That's what interested him. So we can say that Darwin made notes about the living things he saw around the world. Now, perhaps the most famous part that's often referred to when we talk about Darwin is an area known as the Galapagos Islands. And essentially, he spent 19 days in 1835 looking at these islands. The HMS Beagle was found at the Galapagos Islands for about 19 days. Okay. Now, the Galapagos Islands are a series of small islands found off the coast of South America, just outside of Ecuador. Okay. So we can say that Darwin spent 19 days in the Galapagos Islands in 1835. Now, he noticed that lots of animals and plants were on the Galapagos Islands. There was a massive amount of biodiversity. There were so many living organisms that all lived there. And he noted that they must have originally been found on the mainland of South America. He felt that all of the organisms that were found on the Galapagos Islands must have originated from the mainland in South America. So we can say that Darwin, I'm going to put it in red because it's important, Darwin noticed the islands had lots of different animals and plants, and we'll install updates later. We don't want to do that right now. Lots of animals and plants that must have originated from the mainland. So there was lots of organisms found on the Galapagos Islands that all must have originated from the mainland. Now, some of the species he saw on the islands were the same as the ones found on the mainland, but there were some that were slightly different, and there were some that were totally different. He even found that as he moved from island to island, the tortoise species that he saw were totally different from each other. And he also noticed that there were different types of finch on the islands. Okay? So, we can say that Darwin noted that some species were identical between the islands and the mainland. Some were similar and some were totally different. Some were similar and some totally different. Okay? Darwin realised at this point that organisms were not fixed. He noticed that organisms over time must change. They don't always stay the same. And this was an important point that Darwin picked up on. Okay? So I'm going to put in red that Darwin realised that's the worst realised ever. Darwin realised that organisms / species were not fixed. Were not fixed. They could change. Okay? So Darwin travelled around the world on the HMS Beagle between 1831 and 1836. Darwin made notes about living things he saw around the world. He spent 19 days in the Galapagos Islands in 1835, just off the coast of South America. He noticed that the animals and plants found on the Galapagos Islands were either the same as those found on the mainland. They were either slightly different or totally different. Some were even found on the islands that were not found on the mainland. Darwin noted that this meant that organisms were able to change over time. Now, one of the famous examples of this is Darwin's finches. And what Darwin noticed was that on the mainland, you had seed-eating finches. This was a theory he came up with. You had seed-eating finches. Now, on the islands, there wasn't as many seeds. Therefore, if this organism tried to continue eating seeds and there wasn't much seeds left due to other animals eating them, these would not survive and they would die. They would starve to death. However, the other finches that had smaller beaks were able to eat insects because they could get their sharp beak inside of burrows where insects were found. And Darwin theorized, or had a hypothesis, that these were therefore more likely to survive because they didn't have any competition for the food source they were trying to eat, and therefore they were more likely to survive, more likely to reproduce, and over time the finches found on the island had this smaller beak as opposed to this wider beak found on the mainland. Okay? But the important point is that Darwin noted that organisms were able to change. Now, upon returning to England, Darwin took up a hobby of breeding pigeons. Okay? So we can put Darwin and selective breeding. So we've spoken about selective breeding before, and Darwin used this as evidence for evolution by natural selection. So we can say upon returning to England, comma, Darwin bred domestic pigeons. Now, when I talk about pigeons, a lot of people tend to think of these, which are known as a rock dove. Okay, these are the sort of things that we commonly call pigeons, and these are what are found in major towns and cities. However, these are sort of a wild species of pigeon. Again, they're known as rock doves. What Darwin was breeding was domestic pigeons, which look like this, and there are lots of different breeds of domestic pigeon. Okay? However, what you can note is if you look at this wild species of pigeon, the rock dove, you can see that these pigeons all look very similar to that original rock dove. And furthermore, all of these pigeons also look very similar to each other. They just have these key variations that make them slightly different. Okay? So, I don't know why that zoomed out a bit. I'm sure we'll be okay. Darwin was convinced that different breeds of pigeon must have descended from the rock dove. So Darwin was convinced, oh, I've left space, was convinced the different breeds of pigeon descended from the rock dove, which is that one there. Okay? Now, these changes had been made in a short period of time. Somebody had taken rock doves, bred them together for the characteristics they wanted, bless me, and got all these different variants of pigeon. So we can say that using selective breeding, which we've spoken about in previous lessons, using selective breeding, different type breeds of pigeon were formed in a short period of time. Okay? Now, Darwin asked, could this have been similar in nature, but over a longer period of time? Rather than us selecting the characteristics we want, could the organisms be selected based on what was more favourable in the environment? So we can say, finally, I'm going to put in red, Darwin wondered if a similar process happened in nature, if a similar process happened in nature over long periods of time, over long periods of time, with the environment selecting favorable characteristics. So Darwin had his theory based on what he saw on the HMS Beagle and what he saw with selective breeding when he returned back to the UK. So once he returned to the United Kingdom, he started breeding domestic pigeons, and he noticed that the domestic pigeons were very similar to the rock dove that was seen out in nature. And he felt that he knew that all of these types of domestic pigeon had been bred from this original rock dove. And we saw lots of different variations of the rock dove that form new species. Darwin felt that this could have happened in nature. He just didn't really have the evidence, too much evidence to support it. Okay? Now, ultimately, there are modern day pieces of evidence that support this. So we can put the title, Modern Evidence for Evolution by Natural Selection. And we're not going to go into too much detail with this because it's going to make up other lessons that we've already had and that we're going to have. Okay? Now, ultimately, we've got fossil evidence. Fossil evidence shows us how organisms have changed over time. So shows how organisms have changed over time, which we're going to look at in future lessons. We've got antibiotic resistant bacteria. Antibiotic resistant bacteria. Now, because we've got antibiotic resistant bacteria, we can show how new populations can have new traits over generations. So we can see how traits in a species change over many generations. We've got the added benefit now of understanding inheritance. We understand genes and inheritance. So an understanding of genes and inheritance. And this explains how characteristics are passed on. So it explains how traits or characteristics are passed on from parents to offspring. Remember, Darwin didn't have the benefit of this. Darwin didn't understand that we have these genes that are passed on from parents to offspring. So the modern evidence for evolution by natural selection is fossil evidence, which we're going to look at in upcoming lessons. Antibiotic-resistant bacteria, again, which we're going to do a lesson on in upcoming lessons. And finally, an understanding of inheritance via genes, which we've looked at previously already, which Darwin didn't have the benefit of. So, you should now be able to tell me why Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection was not initially accepted. You should be able to explain the evidence that led Darwin to propose his theory of evolution by natural selection. And you should be able to evaluate what we know now about Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection against beliefs that scientists had at the time. I hope you have found this lesson useful. Should you have any questions at all, do not hesitate to get in contact with me, and I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can via the usual means. Until the next lesson, take care.